Can you be addicted to stress and anxiety? I believe that you can be, and I'm going to talk about why in this video. My name is Christina Vero, and I'm a registered psychotherapist who has worked with hundreds of individuals and couples, and a lot of us have talked about how do you deal with stress. But let's come back to this question of, how can somebody be addicted to stress? Well, in my opinion, especially as somebody who's a millennial, I grew up in a time where we defined our self-worth based on how productive we were. It was always like in conversations with friends about who was the busiest and who was doing the most and who was taking on the most work project. And this was really, really celebrated. And I think it's still the case. Even if you go to Chapters or Indigo and all these things, you can see all these mugs and notebooks that say things like hustle or I'm so busy and all of these things, which if you think about it, just sends us some sort of message about our society valuing that. There's a really, really great book on this subject that I love by an author called Celeste Headley called Do Nothing. And she actually goes way back and talks about why it is the case that all of us feel like our self-worth is tied to productivity. One of the things that she talks about that stands out for me is that when we went into factory work, it really became a situation of time equals money. So the more time that somebody spent in a factory, the more products that they could produce, the more money that they were able to make. And that caused a slew of problems, as you can imagine, where now, okay, if my time equals more money and I can be that much more valuable to a company that way, then it's really, really easy to become addicted to overworking. I think the other way that we have brought that into our worlds, though, is in this work from home environment too, of always being really, really paranoid. At least a lot of the people I work with have said this, of being paranoid of making every single second count when you're working from home, because you're worried that your boss or your coworkers or whatever are going to think that you're slacking off if you're not constantly available. And so I feel like things have actually probably escalated in this domain of people just becoming addicted to the stress of work and overworking and being productive. Another part of it too is that if you grew up in a household where things were very, very chaotic, whether that was because there were addictions going on, there was some undiagnosed mental health issues like undiagnosed anxiety, any trauma at all, or you had just like a lot of siblings, a lot going on, and it was a very, very chaotic home life for whatever reason, your nervous system probably thinks that that is normal and that is very familiar to you. And our brains can sometimes feel like change is scary or change is bad or change is uncertain. And so sometimes we stick to the things that we know because we know them and because of that comfort and familiarity. So I find that sometimes, especially for people I work with who may have come from some more traumatic childhood situations, anytime that they feel like things are calm or peaceful, it's actually really dysregulating for them because there's this feeling of, oh, I don't recognize this, and when is something bad going to happen? So there's this paranoia that can come up about that. So that's another way that we might become addicted to stress, because we can then, consciously or not, create these situations that produce stress because that feels more familiar for our nervous system. So what are some signs that you might be addicted to stress? And when I say that you might be addicted to stress, I'm not saying that this is always a conscious thing. Some of us might be like, oh wow, I actually do put myself in these situations that are very stressful. But I think for the vast majority of us, it is maybe not conscious. So I hope this doesn't come across in a blamey way or anything like that. One of the first signs I think that you might be addicted to stress is you're constantly saying yes to new projects, or not really doing an assessment of, can I take that on right now? It just feels like this very habitual and automatic response of, yes, I'll do that. So you might take on a lot of things at work that maybe you don't have the capacity for. Sometimes as well, I see when people are chronically late rather than giving themselves enough time. I am definitely somebody who has a problem with this, where instead of saying, okay, I won't do that activity, I'll just show up and be a little bit early, I might try to squeeze as much as humanly possible into that time, then I end up being late and then I'm rushing, and that, can become your normal. So if you find that you're constantly rushing around or you're constantly late, it's a good question to ask yourself of, is that keeping me in a state of stress really, really unnecessarily? Another sign that you might be addicted to stress is that you have a very, very hard time taking breaks at all. So at work, if you decide to take a break for 5 or 10 minutes, you might just not want to do that at all, so you don't. Or if you do, you might still be checking your work emails or doing work-related things or things in your personal life that are productive during that break because you feel like you need to be using every single second to do something, right? So you might be booking a dentist appointment or whatever it happens to be. Another sign of being addicted to stress is that when you do take a day off, whether that's because you're sick, whether you're taking a mental health or personal day, doesn't really matter, you just feel guilty the whole time. And this is something I'm continually trying to work on myself. So you can't even really enjoy your day off because you feel like, oh, I'm just being lazy, or there's other things that I could be doing. And so that's another way where you might end up working or doing things like that that keep you in a state of stress as well. Also, just having a hard time unplugging outside of work hours could be a sign that you're addicted to stress. So you might have your email notifications open. You might be responding to those emails because you want to be there for your coworkers, answering texts from coworkers, hopefully not. But if you just find that it's really hard for you to disconnect from work as well, it could be another sign that you're dealing with some sort of addiction to stress, whether it's intentional or conscious or not. So in terms of solutions, I think it's really, really important just to be aware that this is something that happens for us in the first place. Just knowing, okay, I have grew up in a particular time where my self-worth is associated with productivity, and therefore when I'm not being productive, I feel kind of bad about myself. I think just knowing that is really, really helpful for a few reasons. One, if I do take a day off, I kind of know that I'm going to have a little talk with myself to give myself a pep talk to know that this is going to happen so that my expectations are set accordingly. But secondly, I think the moment that we can name that something is happening, we're also able to be a lot more critical of the situation and say, okay, now that I know this, are there things that I want to do differently so that my life is better? So I think the biggest thing here is that really we're dealing with a bit of an identity issue, because if we're saying, okay, I'm somebody who really defines my self-worth by how productive I am, then you're going to have an identity crisis during moments when you're not being that way. And knowing that that's going to be a really, really uncomfortable process of untangling your self-worth from productivity and performance is a good thing to know. So a few ideas that I have of how you break out of this cycle. One is to consider and ask yourself, who do I want to be outside of my work identity? Something that I noticed during the pandemic was that a lot of people realized when they weren't going into work and when the world had shut down that they actually just didn't have any hobbies. So they didn't know what to do with a lot of their extra time. And I think that that's really sad and upsetting in its own way. So getting curious about, okay, if I did reclaim my time a little bit more and I always wasn't focused on stress or productivity or performance at work, what would I rather be doing? And also when you do decide to try a hobby, just enjoying it for the fun of it. I think another thing that comes with us always equating our self-worth with performance and productivity is that we're constantly grading ourselves while we're trying to do something new. So we take up watercolor painting, for example, and if we're not good at it immediately, we don't enjoy it. And just learning to enjoy the process and understanding that I'm doing this for fun and I'm doing this to use a different part of my brain and I'm doing this because I feel like it, those are totally valid reasons versus I'm doing this because I want to achieve an outcome. But that is a very ingrained model of thinking that I think we all could benefit from breaking out of just a little bit. Other ways to sort of break this stress addiction is to really allow yourself to take breaks and be very mindful of what you're doing on those breaks. So at work, if you need to schedule a timer on your phone for a certain period of time where it says, okay, now you need to go take a break for 5 minutes, practice doing that and practice using that break to your advantage. So, maybe instead of, like I said before, booking a doctor's appointment or something like that, maybe you just sit outside in silence for 5 minutes. I think that's something that we also could really benefit from, is having these moments where we're not stimulated. And that brings me to my next point in terms of how do we get out of this stress addicted feeling. We deal with so much overstimulation in our day-to-day lives. We're constantly getting notifications on our phones. We are always accessible to people 24/7. We have work, everything we can do for most of our jobs we can do from our phone or our laptop, which is always nearby. And I think that that level of stimulation coming at us all the time also creates like this state of being on all the time in our nervous system in a day-to-day way. They did a really, really interesting study recently where they compared the attention spans that we have for the year 2000 versus presently. And they found that our attention spans went down from 12 seconds in 2000 to 8 seconds presently. And that was across ages and gender. And what's really disgusting about that statistic is that goldfish have an attention span of 9 seconds, which means that we now have a shorter attention span than goldfish. And I think we could all really benefit from taking uninterrupted time and slowing down and turning off the noise around us as much as possible, and also reducing stimulation so that we don't feel like we're constantly on the go. Because I think that is actually a lot of the time an illusion. And the reason I say that is because whenever I go on vacation and I can't use data on my phone, my stress levels are so much lower just from that, just because of the fact that I don't feel like I have to be accessible all the time. And I think that's a huge reason why I come back more relaxed.